Now we're in a position where we have the choice between the passions of our human experience and being tempted to get caught up in that again, or the choice to free ourselves from that. And that freedom is reflected in the hands of the devil. The devil's right hand is the fingers open in air. Air is the element of the mind, if you remember before. And this is saying there's no attachment to thoughts anymore. You become the observer of your thinking. That's what meditation is, by the way. This is the ability to become the observer of your thoughts. And then he's holding a flaming sword. Now, there's a lot to this, and we'll go to this in a minute, but the fire represents the element of desires. And you're now becoming the observer of your desires. So now you've become the observer of your thoughts and your desires. And because you have new knowledge, you're able to see them. Whereas before, without that awareness and knowledge, you were caught up in habit, which is the devil representing everything else there, being tied to our old habits. An anvil even is how we've been existing. And now we have the potential to go to another whole level of awareness.
To Caritas Consciousness Project. I'm Gloria Coelho, and Caritas is dedicated to promoting the evolution of consciousness as the key to individual growth and global healing. And we draw from a wide assortment of both ancient wisdom and leading-edge studies in science, consciousness studies, spirituality, healing, and philosophy. And in addition to our online presentations with guest speakers, we also offer classes and study groups, which are also online. And we have over 100 video recordings on our YouTube channel, which is Caritas Consciousness Project. And you can also access them on our website, which is caritascenter.org. You go to the video library page, and there they are. So as a nonprofit organization, we rely on the support of our members and donors to keep Caritas going. If you'd like to support our program, you can make a donation or you can become a member on the membership page on our website. And now let me introduce tonight's guest speaker. Russell Sturgess studied attitudinal healing with Dr. Jerry Jampolsky in Tiburon, California, and with Susan Trout in Washington, D.C. in the late 80s. As a teenager, early 70s, he was trained in osteopathic massage, later qualifying and practicing very successfully in rural Queensland, that's Australia, in his home state. He went on to be an educator of an Australian osteopathic technique of bodywork called Bowen therapy. Throughout the 90s and the first decade of the new millennium, he taught extensively throughout the USA, New Zealand, and Australia. His programs uniquely married attitudinal healing and bodywork, resulting in what he described as mindful healers. Inspired by the Jungian-based studies he did with Susan Trout, Russell was exposed to the rich symbolism of the tarot, fueled by Sally Nichols' book, Jung and Tarot. After several years of doing his own inner healing work, Russell was inspired to live in Italy for a year, where he researched and wrote about the spiritual roots of the tarot. In 2009, Russell self-published his first book, Metanoia, followed by his second book, Get Out of Jail Card, in 2018. And his third book, which I have here, The Spiritual Roots of the Tarot, which is the one we're going to talk about, was published by Inner Traditions and released in 2020. And it's just fascinating book. From his expanded understanding of the Christian Gnostic mysteries, Russell developed a mindfulness mentoring program in 2009, which is now called Pathways to Mindfulness, and a mindfulness mentor training school called the Center for Western Mindfulness. Russell is a father and grandfather. His youngest daughter, age 34, was born with Williams syndrome, for whom Russell has been her primary carer since she was 12. She recently moved into independent living. Russell lives mostly by himself in a small cottage in a relatively secluded ancient rainforest in southern Queensland called the Bunya Mountains. Aboriginal people historically used the Bunya Mountains as a meeting place for various tribes scattered throughout central eastern Australia. To this day, the Bunya Mountains are seen as a sacred space. Russell's home is off-grid, surrounded by many trees that are hundreds of years old. Almost daily, he has encounters with wallabies, dingoes, as well as a plethora of bird life. Oh, and the occasional snake. So welcome, Russell. Thanks so much. We're happy to have you here, and thank you for making the time.
My pleasure. And
so good to
I
hear
was
you.
kind of I'm glad you can hear me. It's funny because just before I came back on board, I have dingoes, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with dingoes, are wild native dogs.
Wild dog.
And the dingoes were howling just literally as I came back on board with you. And I thought, if I hear them howling again, I'll open the windows so that you can hear them, because they're not far from wherever they were. They're not far from my home, and
they sound like wolves.
They're smaller than wolves, and but they're an interesting breed, and but they're not aggressive like wolves with humans, unless they haven't been treated right. They'll just walk past me sometimes, and they'll look at me as if to go, "Are we okay?" but I sit where I sit here. I look out into the rainforest, and I have a bird bath here, and I have wallabies come past, and small kangaroos, and I have dingoes, and so far I've identified 43 different birds in my bird bath.
Wow.
My office.
I live in the mountains too, Russell. I live also in a rainforest. It's a temperate rainforest, the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York.
Okay.
We don't have dingoes. We have coyotes.
Okay. So similar sort of environments and things going on, which is really lovely. Anyway, we're not here to talk about me and the Bunya Mountains. We call it Bunya Mountains. They have these they're bunya pine. They're a pine tree, and they're bunya nut. So their cone is anywhere from typically average 6 kg in weight, and the nuts inside the cone are bigger than my thumb. And that's what the Aboriginals would come up here for every 3 years. They sort of have a proliferation of produce every 3 years. So, yeah. Now, if you don't mind, in a couple of minutes, I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation.
Sure.
As we go through, and that I've got share screen, so I'll be able to tap that in, and I'll be using that because it's all visual. Obviously, we're talking about tarot cards, and so if I can help enrich our conversation with this,
I was hoping you
to do.
I was hoping you would.
Lovely, thank you. So as was explained right at the beginning there, my work really focuses on the whole notion that the original tarot cards had a much more significant meaning than divining. And of course, for most of us, we sort of relate to tarot as a divining tool. And in fact, divining didn't really start to have any relationship to tarot until the 1600s, late 1600s, early 1700s, and they'd been around for a couple of hundred years. And predominantly they were being used as for games. Il Triomphe, which was the triumphs, was the name of the game, and basically the cards were trump cards, and because that makes sense when we get into talking about them. And of course, the whole concept of trumps in the experience of life was reflected in Petrarch and some of the other sort of authors at that time and philosophers who were sort of teaching this idea that things triumphed over other things. And so this game sort of emerged with these cards. Now, playing cards, interestingly enough, found their way into Western Europe in the 1370s. So they were a fairly late thing to have exposure into Western Europe. And the whole thesis of my book is based on the idea that the Cathar, who found a place of safety in Milan during the 1300s after the Albigensian Crusade in the 1200s, and then the Inquisition that went from sort of 1229 right through to the middle of the 14th century. They systematically went through and got rid of the Cathar. And what I believe and what my thesis is that their manuscripts and their teachings, because they didn't have a lot of churches, particularly once they got into Italy. They did have some churches in southern France, but they were wiped out during the Crusade in terms of the church took them over. And so they met in homes and they met in fields primarily, and they used manuscripts as their way of being able to communicate their teachings. And it's my thesis that their core theology was transposed into playing cards. This is at the time when the Cathar were just about sort of wiped out, and that eventually their images were joined with playing cards. Now, someone who suggested, and it could be a bit of tongue-in-cheek, but it was to avoid paying two lots of entertainment tax, because basically, if you had things like that, you had to pay entertainment tax. And so the idea was when they combined them with playing cards, there was only one lot of entertainment tax being paid. I don't know. That was just a nice story, but they did find a place where they joined together. And eventually those cards, the game, as I said, was called Il Triomphe. It became Il Tarocchi, and there was a point where it became tarot. Certainly what we see is when the cards basically, with the Italian wars and the invasion of France into northern Italy and Milan during the 1500s, early 1500s, late 1400s, we see the cards and the library of the Visconti being taken back into France. And that's where we see the tarot cards starting to emerge into the region of France. And of course, eventually these cards became known as the Marseille Tarot, because that was the region in which they settled in France once they sort of were exposed to the region of France. And they take on a slightly sort of different set of images. I mean, they're very closely aligned to the original that we see that came out of the early 1400s, out of that region of Milan. And it seems that the Visconti and the Sforza families who were ruling Milan at this time were responsible for these cards being put together. And so we know that there was some allegiance between the Visconti and the Sforza and the Cathar. My book talks about that in terms of where those allegiances laid. And so we see those cards sort of emerging. And then once they go into France, they're similar but different. And there's a much richer understanding of the symbolism. So we're going to be looking at the Marseille Tarot. And so I'm going to share start sharing screen with you on this. So if you just bear with me, well, it just takes me a moment to set this up.
Okay.
Okay, hopefully you can see that.
Yes, very clear.
Okay, so what we have here are the major arcana of the Marseille Tarot. These are a fairly late set of images. These were made in around the 1980s, and they're called the Fornio Marseille Tarot. They came out of northern Spain. The reason I use them is because they're colourful, yet they were intrinsically integrous with the original. And so I kind of like them just because they're a little bit more enjoyable and easier to look at, but the symbolism's quite authentic. And so we're going to be using these as the basis of what we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so let's get right into it. I call this the end of suffering, and so it's like the whole idea that there's a deep theology within these 22 picture cards that you see here. These are called the Major Arcana. The suit cards were called the Minor Arcana, the minor secrets, and what we're looking at is what's called the major secrets or mysteries. Okay. There's four sort of elements that I would break these 22 cards into. The first is the Fool, Lamat. He had no number, which meant that he was able to move. He didn't have a position in the sequence. Then we've got cards 1 to 10. So we see the Magician as card number 1 going through to card number 10. Then we have cards 11 through 20, and that starts with the Force card. And then we have the World card, which is card number 21. And so breaking the cards up in this way came as a result of research that I was doing in Italy and where I ended up going with in terms of exposing how these cards were to be understood. And even to this day, the stuff that I'm teaching is pretty unique. I don't think there's anybody out there that's sort of exposing this in this way. Okay. So the thing that I got onto that was an epiphany was the shape of the hats of Force and the Magician. Now, I had the privilege of going to Siena while I was living in Italy and going to see the Il Palio, which is the famous horse race there where the contradas, the different sort of social groups within Siena compete against each other for being the champions. And in the procession, which is a sort of a medieval procession where they're dressed in medieval costumes, there was a character riding one of the horses with exactly that same shaped hat. And this was in 2007 when I was living in Italy. So this hat isn't unique to tarot. This was part of what was part of their world in that particular time. What I saw in the shape of the hat was a key for unlocking the mysteries of the card. And so what I ended up doing was playing with the idea that in fact the cards with the hats actually were to be laid out in this way. And so we've got the Magician's 10 cards that we talked about as one of the sets. On the right-hand side, we've got Forces, 10 cards. Of course, we've got the World card at the back. And then we have the Magician, the Fool, who basically, as I said, he doesn't have a number and he's able to go on the journey And so all of a sudden, there's a whole potential for new meaning by virtue of the cards being laid out in this way. And that's what I'm going to be talking with you about today, is really what this is about. In essence, if I can sum it up, excuse me, I'm just going to open my door here a little bit. It is autumn here, and because I'm in the mountains, it's colder than the rest of Queensland, and I do have a fireplace going, and I just need a little bit of heat into my room. So essentially what's happening here is that the world card is essentially alpha and omega. It's where we come from and where we go back to. And we emerge from the world card, and we come to where the magician is, down in that bottom left-hand corner of the card where the bull is. And we go on this journey where we we're born. If you have a look at card number 3, you can see a woman who's the empress holding a shield and an orb and scepter. She's our mother, and then father, and then we go through the experience of the world, and then we come back through, and then there's another world that we have the potential of moving into, and that's what I'll be talking about today. And so this is sort of basically depicting our journey through life and as a human being, but it's also exploring the notion of our existence as a soul being. And so that's what we're going to be exploring as we're going through. By the way, if anyone has any questions as we're going along, please put a little message through there, and Gloria can let me know.
Okay.
Okay. So here we have the world card, and in the world card you can see the wreath. There's a dancer in the center. That's equivalent to Salome doing the dance of the 7 veils, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. In the corner you've got the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel or man, depending on, but I call him an angel because of the wings. But we have these 4 characters, and I'm going to suggest to you that the most important symbol in all of the tarot is actually found in this image. And it's the space in behind the dancer. It's the empty space behind the dancer is the most important symbol in the Marseille Tarot, because it symbolizes infinite consciousness, eternal knowing, God, if you want to use that word. So this really is the essence of the highest state of consciousness, and it's represented by nothing. It's just this space where everything else has characters and symbols and all of that. This has nothing other, and I'm going to suggest, and this will become more evident as we go along, that this is infinite consciousness. And in fact, I call it I. That's its name, is I. Now, I, infinite consciousness, decided it wanted to explore the concept of embracing infinite possibilities. And what you'll notice here is that you and I are now sharing, and it's funny how often we use the word I in the course of a day, but you and I are now sharing the space of infinite consciousness, and we're looking through the wreath, going back through to the back of the dancer and what's on the other side of the dancer. So in other words, it's like a window opens in infinite consciousness. It's like a crack where it looks through and explores the whole notion that something comes after I, which is am. So we'll flip that back around to the front, okay? And now I'm going to put that I am portal on its side. And on the right-hand side is I, which is knowing. And we've got that am portal. So am, which is that portal is basically a prism where white light, pure light, passes through the prism. And all of a sudden, if you know the concept of a prism, it creates a rainbow: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. So all of a sudden, we have this concept of 7 different colors emerging from pure white light. And of course, it's real, but it's not real, because in fact, all of those colors are pure white light. That's what its reality is. But it takes on the concept of being 7 different colors. And the am is the concept of experiencing. And of course, if you remember on that card, what was there? There was the angel, which represents the element of air and thoughts. The bull, which represents physical and senses. The angel represents water and feelings, and the lion represents heat, hot fire, and desires. So all of a sudden, what we have is this amazing sort of context of I experiencing infinite possibility, and of course, which is experiencing. So once it passes through and it attaches the word am is the potential for experience. Now, as it relates to the tarot, we've got the 7 colors: red, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. Multiply that by thoughts, feelings, senses, and desires within the context, and she's holding, and in fact, she's an androgyny in many regards. You'll see her left hip and her right hip. One's very masculine, more oriented looking, and the other's more feminine looking. And she's holding a wand in her left hand and a vial in her right, and they represented the masculine and feminine states of consciousness. And so when we start to bring all of those variables, you multiply. So you've got the 7 colors multiplied by the 4 states of consciousness, and then multiply by the masculine and feminine. We end up with 56 potentialities. And of course, if any of you are familiar with the tarot, the Major Arcana has 56 cards. And I would suggest to you that those cards represent infinite possibility. So they represent all of the ways in which human beings are able to experience those 56 elements in billions of different ways over unlimited time. Yes.
Russell, we have a question from Michelle. Mm-hmm. Do you want to ask it out loud, Michelle?
Yeah, yes, that'll be fine. Yeah. Hi, Russell. Thank you. This is really interesting. I'm just interested because my understanding of the 4 images are they're actually the 4 gospelers. Does that tie into your scheme?
Well, yes and no. So that was commandeered by the Catholic Church. So we see the gates of Babylon, for example, long before the Catholic Church commandeered Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and tied them up with those 4 elements. Because if you go to Italy, you see those 4 figures everywhere, and oftentimes they're holding books that sort of is symbolizing that. But if you go to the gates of Babylon and Samaria and those images, we start to see the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel existed long before the Catholic Church commandeered them as entryways, representing or sort of representing those states of consciousness. So that became a Catholic interpretation of those four elements. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks.
That's a valid question in terms of relating to the Gospels, because they did become often associated with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Yeah.
And I associate them more with astrology, with the
that's right.
Fixed signs, the four fixed signs.
Absolutely.
Although so in Revelations, he somewhere in Revelations he talks about the bull and the man and the lion and the I don't know if it's the eagle.
In fact, now you're sort of jumping ahead, but I'll ease your concern. It was actually the prophet Ezekiel talks about them as being the cherubim. It was an angel that had four faces: the face of a bull, a lion, an eagle, and an angel. And this was in Ezekiel, and the prophet Ezekiel talks about it. And I'm going to be talking about that a little bit later on. So you've jumped the gun beautifully there. we'll be going there.
So in Revelations, is he quoting Ezekiel?
I would suspect so. I don't remember it being in Revelations, but certainly, it was certainly taught in Ezekiel. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Okay. So we start out with, in our human experience, and I'm sort of, as you can imagine, I could do hours and hours and hours on this information, and I'm sort of pulling the important parts of this as I'm going along. What happens, and I'll just preempt this, the magician and the popess are spirit world entities. Oh, sorry, I've just gone ahead there and I want to come back. The magician and the popess are what we call spirit world entities, and they're basically sitting before the Empress, where she's our mother and we're born as human beings. And as we move into the state of I am, after I entertains the possibility of infinite possibility, we're all part of that infinite possibility, by the way. We're all part of, if I can use these words, God imagining what God isn't, in order to better understand what God is a simple way of saying it. But we're all of that, and basically we're being told that the magician's letting us know on his table, he's got in his hand he's got a wand, in his other hand he's got a coin, on his table he's got cups, and he's got a sword on his table, and he's basically saying you're coming into a world where the wand represents power, the coin represents wealth, the cup represents heart or love, and the sword represents power, as in success, the having won the battle. And he's letting us know that that's going to be our reality. And the popess has a book open, and she's sort of saying, well, what would you like to experience this time around? And then we're born and we're exposed to a world that basically is represented by the emperor, the pope, the lovers, and the chariot are those next four cards. So the emperor represented power, and of course what we ended up with is this dynamic between the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, who generally came out of Germany, and we end up with the Pope. And there was a major conflict that existed, and of course, in the way in which my cards are laid out. So, for example, if we look at these cards here, this is sequencing 4, 5, 6, and 7 from left to right. But if we have a look at the way the cards are laid out in the lemniscate figure, in fact, the Pope sits before the Emperor, and those two are actually facing each other, which is more reflective of the fact that they were in conflict with each other all the time. And the Emperor's even got his symbol of power being held up against the church. And so the Emperor represents the element of power. It's kind of funny to think that the Pope would represent wealth, but this particular image, by the fact that we have two tonsure, which is the hairstyle of the monks who are sitting in front of the Pope. The tonsured monks were the Franciscans. They were the poor monks. And so this literally symbolizes poverty versus wealth. And of course, we're talking about a period around the 1200s to 1300s. By this time, many of the popes were academics. They were lawyers. And we see where before the millennium, the change in the millennium there, we saw a lot of monks were popes. As it became more academics, we start to see the focus of the church becoming more oriented towards wealth and power in terms of what they were focusing on. They were wanting to have control over, we see major conflict between Rome and France, for example, that's going on, so much so that France ended up taking over and taking the Pope to Avignon and setting up the head of the church in France. I mean, that's part of this conflict that was going on. But wealth becomes a very huge agenda of the church during this time. We then have the experience of the lovers, and I see this as representing the notion in the Greek tradition. There's several different types of loves, but what we have depicted here is Eros, Storge, and Philia. And so Eros is the lover, the romantic love. Philia and Storge are family and friends. And so this is that I have, that I feel lovable, that I have a place of being loved in the world between family, friends, and lovers. And so we see that depicted by the three characters there. And success, the Chariot, even to this day, and it's really interesting, here we see depicted a square chariot. And if you go to the El Palio in Siena, the victor's chariot is square. It still has the same shape, and it's got the canopy. It's still exactly the same. Here we are, several hundred years later, and they're still using a chariot, the victor's chariot at the El Palio. The winner of it gets to ride in a chariot that's got this square shape. Now, the interesting thing about all of these things is that if I have those things, then I'm happy. If I have power, in other words, if I have self-determination and I'm in control of my life, then I'm happy. Of course, if I'm being victimized, I'm not happy. If I have wealth, then I'm happy. If I'm poor, I'm not happy. If I'm loved, I'm happy. If I'm not loved, I'm not happy. If I'm successful, I'm happy. If I'm a failure, I'm not happy. So literally, we create a life that's all about being able to have happiness become fundamental to our experience. And of course, this is the blueprint of divine or infinite consciousness in our being, is this connection with happiness and this desire for happiness. It's kind of a funny thing. We sort of don't think of that, but literally the one thing that's been stamped into who we are as a finite expression of consciousness is the desire to sit in the place of happiness, because it's represented by how we become caught up in the whole thing of the objects of wealth, power, love, and success. And we spend so much of our consciousness literally playing around with the spectrum between the absence of those things or the presence of those things, which at its core sits in our being as happiness or not. Now, what's interesting is that the magician is an illusionist. That's what a magician does. He plays tricks. And one of the big messages of the magician is that he's saying, this is all an illusion. None of this is real. Well, we know that because this is God's mind that we're in. This is God entertaining infinite possibility. I want you to think about that. It's like, hang on a second. And the parallel for that is our experience at night time when you go to sleep. When you're asleep, effectively you're not conscious of the world in which we live in. But all of a sudden, a reality appears in your state of sleep that for all intents and purposes is real as the one that we live in. So while you're sleeping in that dream state, here you are now in a world in your dream state where everything is real. You can touch, taste, smell, everything. You can have all of the feelings that you have as a human. You have all of the thoughts, potential for thoughts. You have desires, everything that it is that is part of. You have senses, sensations, everything that you experience, you're experiencing in your dream. And can I suggest to you that basically in your dream state, you are exploring infinite possibilities in your very own dream state. So in the course of a night, you can have a whole, heaps of different experiences during one night's sleep, let alone a lifetime of sleep. And so in your very own sleep, in your state of deep sleep, in your state of, so it's not just REM, but even in deep sleep, we're dreaming. In this state of being not aware, you're having this experience, and for all intents and purposes, it's all real. You even have tastes of it when you wake up. You know, you have the fear, you have the arousal, you have a joyful memory. You have those moments where, because of how real it was while you're in your sleep. But when you wake up, how real was any of that? Do you have to feel guilty about having an affair in your dream? Do you have to be punished because you murdered somebody in your dream? You see, what happens is the minute we wake up from the dream, none of it was real. It was an illusion. Yet, in the illusion, it was real. Sure felt real while you're in it. But the minute you wake up, you realize that none of it was real. Can I suggest to you that you and I are part of God's dream? God entertaining the notion of infinite possibility in the same way we do when we dream. And in fact, I would suggest to you that the reason we dream, I think, is twofold, and this is my thought, is so that we understand the experience of infinite consciousness and what's really going on. Plus, we're value adding infinite possibility, exploring infinite consciousness, exploring more infinite possibility via our dreams and what we're doing. It sort of it takes it to the nth degree in terms of that infinite level of possibility. So what does that mean in terms of what we're experiencing here? Do we have to suffer the consequences of the mistakes that we make? Do we have to repent? Is there anything that we have to be held accountable for in the big scheme of things? In the dream state, we live within a social order and there's rules and things that exist here. But in the divine state, is there anything, in just the same way when we wake up in our dreams, when we wake up in God's dream, is there anything that we have to be accountable for? I want you to sit with that and play with that as an idea. Within that realm of the world of illusion, there existed three elements that help to give perspective on what this was all about. The first card is the justice card, which is about justice, but it's about natural justice strongly, which is the idea that, you eat. I lived in Italy, as I said, for a year, and they used to have these amazing donuts that were just full of jam and cream, and they were phenomenal. And they were called bumbas, which I understand means big bottom. And I think they were saying this is the natural result of eating too many of these, is a bumba, natural justice. That when we look at things like, where people are taking drugs or eating too much sugar or, doing things, it's not like somebody's standing there punishing you. There's a natural consequence for our choices in terms of the things that go on. The sword, so the scales represent natural justice, the sword represents justice. There is some elements of justice as well. The hermit represents aging and dying, the prospect of getting old, and all of a sudden things that made us happy all of a sudden impact on our lives and take away our happiness. The prospect of dying, the whole idea of that the possessions that we've accumulated are going to mean nothing shortly. We've put all this energy into this, and in a short time, it's all going to be gone. It's not going to have any relevance. And then, of course, fate and chance, the wheel of fortune. So the wheel of fortune can turn and things can be taken away from us. So all of a sudden, the something that establishes our happiness and therefore our sense of being okay has no relevancy anymore, because these things literally take them away from us. They create circumstances and situations where wealth, power, love, and success are not sustainable. And we're forced to confront the notion that this world of illusion, this sense that I am something, has no sustainability. That the happiness associated with things external to myself don't actually bring sustainable happiness. So let's come back to this lemniscate figure. So here we've got the magician down in that bottom from our perspective, left-hand corner of the world card. And you can see the magician and the popess, spirit world, basically, they represent, she's looking through a veil, by the way, the popess, into the human world. There we have the mother, the empress. She's given birth. If any of you probably can't see it here, but if you ever come across a set of Marseille tarot cards, you'll see, and if you look closely at this, you'll see on her left hip, just beside her left hip, is the wing of a bird. Its feathers. And this is her giving birth. And we see the bird then being depicted on the shield, being held by the empress and at the foot of the emperor. And this represents you and I in our human state. It's a symbol of the immature Christ, if you want to call it that, the fool. And then we've got the emperor, and we can see here where the Pope and the emperor facing each other, facing off against each other. We've got wealth, we've got love, then we've got success, then we've got justice, time, and chance. So we go through this journey of the human experience, and we get to this crossroad where all of the things that we thought were important have been taken away from us by virtue of justice, time, and chance. Now, what happens is we have one of four ways, obviously, being at an intersection, that we can go. The first one is that we can stay exactly where we are, and we do that antidepressants, consumerism, drugs, alcohol. In other words, anything that basically numbs us to our suffering. Because literally, when justice, time, and chance have stepped in, we are suffering. Now, I don't know how things are in the United States, but right now here in Australia, we've got an epidemic of suffering here in Australia right now. In terms of the cost of living, people can't even afford. We've got people now, which we've never had before, living in tents and living in cars, and that's never happened en masse in Australia. I can remember at one stage during the 80s, I think it was, when I was going to the United States and going into the 90s, there was one point there where America sort of looked a little bit like Australia has up until recently, and all of a sudden I saw homelessness and people during that period in the late 80s where people were standing on the exits of highways with signs wanting work, and I'd never seen that before in America. And you guys had that much earlier, going back then, but we're only having that happen now. But there's a lot of suffering going on because justice, time, and chance are all having their impact in this nation here, and that's what happens is that interest rates are going up here in Australia. People can't afford to sustain paying their mortgages on their homes. I mean, we've got a major crisis happening here at the moment. But this isn't just here. This is global. And of course, there's a whole lot of reasons why things are happening global. But it's all about the state of suffering. The fact that we can't sustain happiness. And so when we get to that part of the crossroad, we end up, as I said, marking time, and we do it through addictions primarily or through medication. The other option for some people is they get there and go, I can do this again. So getting to that point is a dark night experience. And the other three are different ways of experiencing the dark night. The dark night of the senses is when, in my sensation of experience, I'm hurting and I'm going to have another go at doing it again. And so we come back around and we basically re-engage the emperor, the pope, the lovers, and the chariot. And so we have another go at creating our life. So we get, we divorce, we get a new partner, we have a different type of car, different type of job. We try to recreate the illusion. And of course, instead of it taking 30 or 40 years to get to the crossroad, this time it takes us 5 to 10 years. And some people will go back a third time and have another go at it, because that's all they know. Happiness is only going to be found in those things external to me. They keep on going there. And of course, the numbing point is I don't have the energy, and I'm suffering. I'm not happy, so I'll take whatever I can to numb the suffering. That's literally what goes on at the Wheel of Fortune. When we go over to where the Judgment card is, which is sort of where the eagle is in the World card in that top right, as we're looking at it, that's suicide. That's where we opt for suicide, whether that be quick suicide or drawn out suicide. You know, a diabetic who keeps on choosing to drink sugar, soft drinks, and to eat in a way that compounds diabetes is suicide. It's just slow suicide. So we have that as an option. The other option is down the other corner, and that's the dark night of the soul. So this is about the point at which, and we'll go into that in a minute, because that's the journey we're going to go on, is the journey through the dark night of the soul. You and I are familiar with all the rest, if not personally, then certainly in terms of the people in our community, our friends and our networks. We know of people suiciding. We know of people whose lives have been numbed by addictions, whether it be, as I said, you know, antidepressants are sort of a global institution in terms of probably the most important drug. I don't know about what's happening in the United States, but in Australia, the number of people who are using recreational drugs in Australia is now over 50% of the people from the age of 14 onwards. It's now understood that they're using recreational drugs. Over 50%. I heard a police report the other day where they do alcohol and drug testing on the highways for drivers. It was like just a few percent of people came in with alcohol, but they had a huge percentage of people testing for drugs. It's the way that people are able to numb the suffering, the lack of happiness. What we don't have is people who, first of all, intimately understand the journey through the dark night of the soul, that are able to help guide and walk people through that journey. And of course, what we also have is a whole world that doesn't understand that the dark night of the soul journey even exists as a potential. And that's what I want to do now, is talk. And that's what the beauty of these cards did, is it actually gave us a very, very beautiful, clear description of the journey through the dark night of the soul. So without wealth, power, love, and success, I'm suffering. And here's the hanged man. All of the limbs of the trees beside him have been pruned. That's justice. Time and chance have done the pruning of all the things that he thought were real in the world of illusion. He's now hung upside down. You can see even his legs are in the shape of the four, which represents the fact that the four elements have been turned upside down. Wealth, power, love, and success they've been emptied out in his life. But he's hanging. He's hanging by a thread. And that thread is grief. That thread is the attachment that he still has to wealth, power, love, and success. And the fact that those are inbuilt into his consciousness, into his programming, as the measures and the things that you need in order to feel happy. And so this is in a place of grieving. And it's part of my thesis that, in fact, and we know for a fact that the Cathar only subscribed primarily to the Sermon on the Mount as being the true scriptures. As far as they were concerned, the Cathar, the rest of it had been commandeered by the Catholic Church, determined by the Catholic Church, in many cases had been distorted by the Church. And so they subscribed to the Sermon on the Mount as being the purest teachings in the scriptures. They had others. The first 16 chapters of John, they felt were fairly substantial. Some of Revelations, they had bits and pieces, but primarily it was the Sermon on the Mount. And in particular, they had a particular connection with the Beatitudes. And I'm going to suggest to you that this first card is blessed are the poor in spirit. So in other words, from the Cathar perspective, this is a place of blessing, this place of having things stripped away. And even though we're in a place of grieving, it's perfect. We're in the place where we potentially are ready to move on. If I go back, if we go back a little bit, down that bottom right-hand corner was a lion in the world card, if you remember, and force is holding open the mouth of a lion. There's two lions. That's quite significant, but because two lions at the entrance of a building were basically there to check that the hearts of the people who were entering were soft. And so this is, your heart has been beaten to a pulp by virtue of the fact that you've lost all of the things that you thought were important. What we love ultimately is driven by our need to be happy. In other words, we love what brings us happiness. And as a result, we then value those things that bring happiness. And we spend our time, our energy, our resources, our money on what we value. I want you to think about that. If you want to know what's important to you and where your happiness agenda is, have a look at how you're spending your time, your money, and your resources, and why you're spending it. That will give you a really clear indication of what you value and where you think happiness exists. Okay. At this point, we've gone from I am something to now being in a position where I am nothing. It's all been taken away. It's all been stripped away. And then in this place, we go through the experience of nothing. Blessed are those that mourn, for they shall be comforted. The death card. Interestingly enough, the death card, as you can see here, classically didn't have a name. You can see temperance has a name, the devil, the house of God, and the other ones, but this one has no name. And that's because it's alluding to the idea that this isn't what we would call classical death. And this is the point at which we have the opportunity to become the observer of our grief. So mourning literally is the experience of observing grief. In Italy, they had wailers, and what the wailers were doing was symbolizing the pain that people was experiencing. Now, when the pain's inside of us, which is our grief, we're not observing it, we're feeling it, we're buying into the object of our pain and what we're feeling, our feelings and our thoughts. We're completely connected to those. But when we get involved in mourning, It's like we're stepping outside of our thoughts and feelings, and we're now becoming the observer of them, whether it's symbolized by whalers, whether it's journaling, whether it's talking with somebody else, whether it's doing a piece of art, whether it's dancing. In other words, we create an external manifestation that allows us to become the observer of the thoughts and feelings. And so if you have a look at this character, there's a lot of emphasis on the face and the eyes. It's not a classical skull, but he represents this idea. And it suggests that how we sever our attachment to, and we can see all of the characters in the ground who are symbolic of wealth, power, love, and success. The way that we sever that is through the process of mourning, by becoming the observer. Now, the observer doesn't feel anything. If you're truly sitting in the place of that which observes, you're observing thoughts, you're observing feelings, but you're not feeling the feelings and you're not thinking the thoughts. You're just observing them. I'm going to suggest to you that, in fact, as this particular beatitude says, blessed are those that mourn, for they shall be comforted. In fact, there is huge peace and comfort in becoming the observer. In the place of that which observes, you don't think or feel or sense or perceive. All you're doing is know what's going on. You're becoming that which knows, the knower, the observer. You're aware of it, but you're not feeling or experiencing it. There is no experience. In fact, what happens in this place for the first time, there's a separation between I and am experiencing. So when you step back to become the observer, in that moment, you're starting to sit in the place of you as the I. And then what you're observing is the am experiencing. So now this is your first touch of separating out the difference between your core being and the experience that you're having. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. So this is now the capacity to hear. And so here we see this beautiful figure. She's pouring water into an empty vessel. That water is knowledge. It's the experience of grace. And if you have a look at the flower, the five-petaled rose is no longer white. The five-petal white rose was the symbol of virginity. And here we see a five-petal red rose, which is the symbol of conception. And this is the point at which Christ consciousness, divine consciousness, in us as a human being, is now being implanted into our consciousness. We are now being impregnated with the possibility of infinite consciousness being part of our reality. And this is the case, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. This is the point at which we have now reached the very bottom of what we can. We're now prone face down on the earth. We're humble, we're teachable. And as the saying goes, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And this is the point at which the teacher appears and starts to begin to give us new knowledge and understanding about the true nature of the I and infinite consciousness. Now, that means that we're becoming aware by virtue of new knowledge. And awareness means that we're in a position to make a choice. I want you to think about that. Awareness means we're in a position to make a choice. If we're not aware, we can't make choices. We can only function habitually, doing what we've always done. So the minute that we have awareness, now we can make a choice. And this relates to the Beatitude. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. So now we're in a position where we have the choice between the passions of our human experience and being tempted to get caught up in that again, or the choice to free ourselves from that. And that freedom is reflected in the hands of the devil. The devil's right hand is the fingers open in air. Air is the element of the mind, if you remember before. And this is saying there's no attachment to thoughts anymore. You become the observer of your thinking. That's what meditation is, by the way. This is the ability to become the observer of your thoughts. And then he's holding a flaming sword. Now, there's a lot to this, and we'll go to this in a minute, but the fire represents the element of desires. And you're now becoming the observer of your desires. So now you've become the observer of your thoughts and your desires. And because you have new knowledge, you're able to see them. Whereas before, without that awareness and knowledge, you were caught up in habit, which is the devil representing everything else there, being tied to our old habits. An anvil even is how we've been existing. And now we have the potential to go to another whole level of awareness in terms of being aware of our thoughts and aware of our desires. Interestingly enough, the mind and desires, the fire and the air elements are the masculine elements. And so this is recalibrating masculine consciousness. Okay? If you remember, we talked about the feminine and the masculine. This is a major shift in that. The flaming sword is one of the two tests, or one of the two symbols. When Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, God placed cherubim and a flaming sword at the eastern gate. So they became benchmarks of consciousness that basically determined whether Adam and Eve could enter back into the Garden of Eden or not. How many sermons have you heard at church about the test of the flaming sword and the cherubim, or about the flaming sword and cherubim as benchmarks for entering back into the Garden of Eden, the presence of God? So what is the flaming sword? It's what I call the Abrahamic test. This is the point at which you have to recognize and sacrifice your childhood narrative, your programming by your mother and father that has you buy into the world of illusion in the way that you do, and by that, try to find happiness in the world in the way that you do. If you remember, Abraham is asked to sacrifice Isaac. Now, Isaac is a metaphor for Abraham's narrative. What's Abraham's narrative? Abandonment as a child by his father. In the Islamic version of the story of Abraham and his father is that his father abandoned him. So much so that Abraham had to leave his country of his birth and he was having so much pain that the whole thing of parent-child relationship became intrinsic to his narrative. He even took Lot with him because he needed somebody that he could connect to as the parent-child. And of course, if you know the story of Abraham, he spent a lifetime dealing with the issue of children. That's what Isaac became all about. Along the journey, he has Ishmael to Sarah's handmaiden because of his narrative around not having children. And we know that it's a narrative because what does God promise Abraham? If he's righteous, more children than there would be grains of sand on the beach and stars in the sky. When we start to piece all this together, Abraham's got a major narrative around abandoned child and childhood relationship stuff. And of course, it's no wonder when he and Sarah eventually have a child, and they're now sort of somewhere around 100 years old, God says, I want you to take Isaac and I want you to sacrifice him. What God is essentially saying is, you can't serve me and have a narrative around abandonment. And I want you to show me that you're not attached to a narrative. I need you to sacrifice your narrative. So he's not sacrificing Isaac. He's sacrificing his narrative. And that requires a sword or a knife to cut his throat and a flame to light the sacrifice. So in the story, Abraham's up on the mountain. It's all about to happen. He's about to cut Isaac's throat, and an angel appears and goes, no, God just needed to know you're happy to do this. There's a ram over there. Sacrifice that. This is the point at which we have to, through, and this is how the sacrifice is done, through awareness. That's how we sacrifice the narrative, is by becoming aware. The open hand, the sword and the flame, they're right there in front of the devil. He's looking at them. He's the observer of the thoughts. He's the observer of the desires. And it's the observer that literally becomes the mechanism of sacrificing. When something is observed, this is quantum mechanics and physics, when something is observed, it changes. If anybody's seen the double slit experiment, if you haven't, go and look it up and have a look at that in the way in which when atoms were observed in the experiment, they changed their behavior. When they weren't being observed, they had a whole different behavior. This is exactly the same in terms of what's happening within our energy and our consciousness. When we become that which is the observer, that which is aware, then reality starts to change.
Russell?
Yes.
I want to interject something here while we're talking about this, because in your book, I love the part where you talk about it's not about sacrifice. And it has to do with the awareness. And you say there are essentially two ways to approach change. The most common is through applying personal will and discipline. In other words, sacrifice. And in the majority of cases, this isn't sustainable. The more sustainable way is when change is adopted as a voluntary act of self-love and kindness. And that, you know, when we're aware that it's not about what we're losing or what we're giving up, but it's about what we're gaining, that sacrifice is turned into non-sacrifice or, you know, loving kindness.
Well, the interesting thing is that when we become that which observes, and we had a taste of this in morning, all of a sudden we begin to experience peace.
Exactly.
And
Yes.
the more that you continue to maintain observation and that peace continues, happiness begins to emerge from within. It actually has nothing outside. Peace naturally extends to happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
in that place of happiness, in fact, that's why we then enter the house of God. So what happens in that place of happiness, we actually just release without will or discipline, as you just rightly said, Gloria. We actually release our attachment to wealth, power, love, and fame because it no longer serves us in this place, because the happiness, we've found it within. There's an interesting scripture, and I think that, to me, Matthew 13:15 is the core teaching of the Christian concept. Anytime they should see with their eyes, that's the morning card. That's what he's doing. Hear with their ears, being teachable. That's what's going on in meekness. And should understand with their heart. So this is, what's the state of my heart? What am I passionate about? And is my passion oriented towards awareness or towards habit? The things that I, based on my narrative. Because our narrative directs, our childhood narrative directs where we find happiness. And should be converted. And that's the release. So here we are in the place where the conversion is that in this place of being aware, in this place where I'm experiencing peace and I'm experiencing happiness from within, in that moment, I let go of special relationships, two people falling out of the tower. There's no more special relationships anymore, which was reflected by the lover's card. And the tower and the crown are all representing the things associated with wealth and power and success. None of those things exist anymore. They're not important anymore, because now I realize that I can find my happiness within. And then Jesus said, and then and I'm going to say to you that anytime Jesus is quoted as saying the word I, it's not Jesus. That's Jesus referring to infinite consciousness, which he now understands he is one with. So he's talking about the collective infinite consciousness, not him, when he says, and then I should heal them. The word health is really interesting. It shares the same roots as the word whole, holy, and hello. And it literally meant to be one with God. The word disease, dis means not. The word e shares the same root as the word adjacens or adjacent, and it came from the Latin adjacens, which means to be nearby or next to. And literally, disease means to be not nearby or next to. It's a state of separation. So basically, what we're being told here in this Matthew 13:15 is that if we can see with our eyes, hear with our ears, and understand with our heart, have an intention around what we're passionate about, where our love is, and then be converted, in other words, naturally choose to stay in the place of peace and happiness. We're not sacrificing anything. We're not having to use will or discipline to be in this place. If you've got to use will and discipline, you're going to go back and have to go through it again. This is a self-loving choice to sit in the place where happiness is now being experienced within. I should heal them. And that's where we begin to start to experience oneness in this place with infinite consciousness. And here we see, I talked about this before, this is a lovely piece of art in a cathedral in Siena. And you can see cherubim and the flaming sword at the eastern gate, as it was called, and God expelling Adam and Eve out of the garden. So cherubim, according to Ezekiel, was a angel that had four faces: the face of a bull, a lion, an eagle, and an angel. And that's represented, by the way, in the flag that's on the trumpet of Michael the Archangel. It represents those four elements coming back into one in their highest expressions. That's what it symbolized. And the flaming sword, of course, is seen in the devil card where he's holding onto the flaming sword. The Cathar saw these as two really important elements in terms of the spiritual journey and have had them depicted in these images. Being aware of my thoughts and desires, I am peaceful. It's the state, it's the natural state of awareness, and being the observer is to be peaceful. That because you're not thinking, you're not desiring, you're not feeling, you're not sensing, you're not perceiving. There are all the objects. You're sitting in that which is observing those things, which is aware of them, and it doesn't feel anything. It doesn't experience anything. It is just I. And it's peaceful. It's peace. Being peaceful, I find my happiness and fulfillment within. And that's the point at which I no longer have any attachment to the world of illusion. I'm still living in the world of illusion, but I have no attachment to it. I'm still experiencing objects, but instead of being fully immersed in the object, I'm now that which is aware of the object. And I now immerse myself in staying in that place of being aware. How's our time going, by the way?
Yeah, I want to have some time for questions. So maybe another 5 or 10 minutes on the slides.
Being fulfilled, love is all that I am. So what happens is when our state of being within us comes to this point, we experience being as peace and happiness, and then being expressed externally then appears as love and beauty. And so here we see the in the star card the feminine. We talked about the masculine, which was represented by the element of air and fire. Here we see earth and water. So we now see the feminine being merciful. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. So here we see her pouring water onto the earth and into the water. This is basically the acts of mercy, spiritual and corporal acts of mercy. This is social justice. So pouring water onto the earth is feeding the hungry, visiting the sick, doing good to those that that need it. In terms of, I think that was in Matthew 25. Jesus talks about this is how we should be behaving in this state of consciousness. And then she's pouring water into the water, and in the Sermon on the Mount, this is where Jesus talks about forgiveness. Do good to those that hurt you, pray for those that despitefully use you, etc., etc. And this is where we move into this place of completely being able to stay in a loving space in terms of how we experience life now, with this new state. And this is the feminine state of consciousness. Once you get into my book, the rich symbolism in all of this is just mind-blowing, and you'll be able to explore that in a much richer way. Pure in heart, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. This is actually the birth of Christ consciousness in our consciousness. This is the point at which we are now fully aligned within our being with infinite consciousness. The crayfish represents the constellation of the crab, and right in the middle of the constellation of the crab is a set of stars that are called Priapus, and it literally means the crib or manger. So that's why this was included in this. This represents the point at which we were impregnated when we were with temperance, if you remember. Now we've gone through the process now of purifying our state of consciousness to the point at which the birth of Christ consciousness now emerges in this place. The building on the right is the old Jerusalem. The building on the left is the new Jerusalem. And what was the new Jerusalem? That was the bride of Christ. This was the expression of the feminine face of God that was coming to be the bride of Christ. That's the sacred yoni. That's the I am portal that we saw right in the very beginning. That's that wreath that's in the shape of the mandala. That's the sacred yoni.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are now moving to this place of purity of being, in terms of love is all there is, in terms of how we relate. And blessed are the peacemakers. This is the point of non-duality, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. But what happens is that all of these things now mean that at a physical level in the world, we turn up as bearers of love by virtue of being merciful. We maintain a consciousness of love in our own being, and consequently then that's how we begin to relate in everything that we be. And then finally the peacemaker is the point at which we see the Christ in everybody. Hitler, Buddha, and everybody in between. In other words, it's the point, the peacemaker is where there is no duality. This is a painting that I came across in the Louvre. It's a 16th century painting out of Russia, and it's a really beautiful depiction of everything that we've just been talking about. And here we see the Christ surrounded by the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel, those four little triangles in the corner. And this is the point at which the Christ is integrating us in our Christ consciousness, is integrating who we are physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually into its highest expression. That's the test of the cherubim, that we've been able to basically fully immerse our thoughts, our feelings, our desires and perceptions and our senses into love. That's purity of heart that we saw. And now it is fully integrated in love. And here we see the Christ entering back through the sacred yoni. It's even got like a hymen drawn into that figure around the Christ. This is the sacred vagina of the feminine face of God that the Christ is entering back through, just above where Jesus is in that bottom diagram. This is the point at which the Christ fully identifies with the I, and it passes back through the I am, and then you can see where God is seated on the seat. Eventually, in that right hand one, we see the Jesus is at one with God. This is the point at which he's fully integrated back with the I at this point. It's not the I am. The I am is where the sacred yoni is, where that sacred vagina is. That's the portal of am. Anything on this side of that is am. experiencing. Anything on the other side is just I. So I am everything. And so here we have, it's interesting, the word paradise literally means beside a wall. That's what it means. Essentially, it means to be beside a wall. And here we are. This is on the secret or sacred rose garden. This is the wall of where they have to pass through the entrance back into the Garden of Eden, which is on the other side of the wall. And the test of the flaming sword has already been complete. The test of the cherubim has been complete. And now we see the point at which all we see is the I in everybody else. So not only is it within ourselves, we see that. When we go, he is, she is, they are, those words of he, she, and all of those things are the I. And we're separating the essence of who they are in their I being, because we can do it from themselves, from am or are or is experiencing. Because at this point, we recognize that the experience is God playing with the idea of infinite possibility. It's part of the dream. And here's what it looks like in your day. In the course of your day, you spend more time sitting in the awareness of the I and more energy focused on that than you are on the am experiencing. You see, what we spend our time doing is focusing on the am experiencing. It's just an illusion. The real part of you is the I. And this is the point at which our awareness now shifts from the experience to being aware that I am aware. And now what ends up happening in this place is that you now recognize that all you are is knowing the experience, not the experience. In every minute, you are knowing the experience. In that place, that knowing is infinite consciousness. And all of a sudden, all of those elements of separation begin to disappear in that place. Here's a beautiful depiction of the angel with the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the angel. This is Ezekiel's image of the cherubim. Even she disappears. The sacred yoni disappears, and in this place, all there is I. Okay.
Okay. Okay. So this book is amazing and goes into a lot of depth about the Cathars, about the Holy Grail, about the tarot, of course, but it follows the whole journey of the Fool, which is each of us, represents each of us, through the whole journey of becoming more and more aware, and then going through the dark night of the soul and coming out the other side and finding enlightenment, essentially. So one of the things that I was wondering as I read the book, it seems that an important motivation for the Cathar code or the Cathar teachings of spiritual development was to avoid what they call refleshing or reincarnation, because there was no punishment, there was no hell or purgatory, there was just reincarnation. That was the terrible consequence of not reaching the purest state, right? And I was wondering each time that came up, did they have an equivalent to the Bodhisattva tradition of, coming back to help to serve, even though the person has reached perfection or purity or whatever you call it, enlightenment, salvation, kingdom of heaven. They've reached that point. Did they have that bodhisattva equivalent?
When you start to look at the possibility of what we've been talking about today, all of a sudden it's like if God is investing in the concept of infinite possibility, then we're part of that. We're God's dream, and so we're going to have every opportunity to be all of those elements. Which is about how to turn up with full love consciousness in this reality. But at the same time, it's also going to be about the consciousness of suffering and pain and all of that. So we're experiencing all 56 dimensions. I mean, it's really lovely. I mean, I don't do tarot reading. I've never done tarot reading. But when you look at those 56 cards and they represent all of the best and the most horrible of the horrible of what those elements represent in terms of that whole spectrum. So so the thing to remember, and this is my take on this, is that the dimensions of time and space are only exist in the sleep, in the dream. And so all time is now. All incarnations.
The experience
is time and space.
Right? Yeah. I had someone, a speaker one time say to me, you know why I don't believe in reincarnation? And I said, why not? And he said, because if there's no such thing as time, it's all happening at once. So you can't really have reincarnation. And I said, well, do you remember being a child? Do you remember being a teenager and an adult? It's all happening at once also. But in our experience, it happens in stages. And in the same way, reincarnation, yes, ultimately it's an illusion, but it's also our experience, right? Yeah.
And I guess the bottom line is, and this is a hard one to grasp, is that we actually don't exist as an individual.
Right. It's a dream.
It's a dream.
It's a dream.
All there is I. All there is knowing. And that knowing, that is infinite knowing. And when we come back to that place of recognizing that even here now, all there is to us is the knowing of our experience. You're all sitting there in a chair right now. How do you know you're sitting in a chair? Well, because you've done it so many times, but there's a part of you that is in the state of knowing that you're sitting in a chair. That's life. It's actually the fact of knowing. It's the one consistent. Next minute you're standing. How do you know you're standing? Because you're knowing you're standing. Knowing's consistent. It doesn't change. So that adds another dimension to that in terms of that prospect of is there reincarnation? Sure. That's part of the infinite possibility experience of the divine.
Yes, and the Cathar did believe in it. And they also were very emphatic about the need for service, right?
Absolutely.
The need for service. And so I thought, well, is there such a thing as coming back willingly to serve?
Absolutely.
Right? Okay. Absolutely. So I don't know if other people have questions. I'd like to open it up for questions. I have lots more questions, but I'd like to give everyone a chance. So does anyone want to comment or ask?
So Jeff
Jeff and Vicky Ann, yes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the talk, and I had a couple questions for you. A couple of them are just kind of like basic. I kind of missed, my hearing's not that great. You said the first card was the Fool, and then the next card, 10, were the Magician, and then the next 10 were something else? Or did you
Force or Strength is her name. Force.
What was that?
Force or Strength.
Okay. And I was wondering, do you use the Marseille Tarot for prognostication, or do you just use it as a spiritual exercise?
It's a map. It's a spiritual map, and that's all I use it for.
Okay. And my other question is a little about history. I mean, my understanding, I think I read somewhere, and I don't know, that they say that maybe the Cathars were a continuation of like Gnostic Christianity that kind of went underground, and then it came up under the Cathars, and then maybe the Albigensians later, or under Louis XIV, but they kept being
Albigensians and Cathar were the same, essentially. There were different versions of Catharism. Many was a prophet that existed just after the death of Jesus, not long after, who spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe and in the Asian states, and Mani came back across in his teachings to the West, and Manichaean teachings then emerged, which were an extension of Mani's work, and Manichaean was Gnosticism. Basically, it was the roots of Gnosticism. Yep.
Okay, thank you very much.
I think one of the things that turned the church against the Cathar was, there were a lot of things, I think, but one of them was the fact that women were equal to men in the Cathar code. And they could even become perfecti, which was the name of the priest, the term for priest, the equivalent of priest. And it was one of the reasons why the church objected so much, that and many other things. But the early Christians also had women priests in the very beginning.
In the very beginning.
Yeah. I wonder, I guess that changed with Constantine, or?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. We see even as late as, and I talk about in the Visconti, that the Visconti and the Sforza had been excommunicated by the Catholic Church. So they were at odds with the church, and they were going to create their own church. And they were going to have a pope, but in fact, it was a cousin of Matteo Visconti who was going to, and it was a woman, and she was going to be the popess, and they were going to create a church with a popess. Unfortunately, the church got to her and she was executed. But it was an interesting fact that we see this thread of this honouring of women. Being equal status was very, very much a part of that Cathar tradition. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? One thing that I really liked in your book was the notion of the narrative from the 7-year-old. So at the age of 7, by the age of 7, we have accumulated certain beliefs about ourselves based on parental conditioning, societal conditioning, and that narrative or that story that we have about ourselves really influences us through our whole lives until we start waking up to the fact that this is what's driving us, right? And there's a section that I thought I might read on page 280. It says, of course, all fear arises from your story, the programming received in your formative years. This is the point in the fool's journey where he no longer identifies with the fearful experience of his story. So this is in the part of the moon card, where he no longer identifies with the fearful expression of his story. In fact, he comes to the realization that in order to establish his worth while in his story, he developed a variety of skills and abilities to try to prove his worth, right? So if he believed that he wasn't worthy because maybe his family didn't have money, so he goes out of his way, full steam ahead, to become a very rich man, right? The skills that he learns on the way to that, you say, if your story had been about not being noticed, for instance, you may have become skilled in public speaking, acting, fashion, or politics as a means to be noticed. With the 7-year-old being in control, he or she has no idea what being noticed actually looks like. So when the fool does get noticed, the experience is short-lived, since the story of not being noticed overrides the reality, right? But then, so that drives the fool to push harder, and what eventually leads to exhaustion, depression, burnout, etc. But then, taking on the mantle of Christ, the fool takes the skills that his story has afforded, and being inspired to act with compassion and benevolence, he finds ways to use those same skills to serve. And I thought that was a beautiful, just full circle that is so important to realize that even though we might have been climbing the wrong mountain, the skills that we learned on the way can be used in service and to benefit ourselves and others. Right?
In the work I do, I have a saying that our narrative is the gift we gave ourselves to serve humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
And,
yeah.
And look, if a big part of the work that I do is I've created a mentoring program, a mindfulness mentoring program, which is basically taking people through the dark night of the soul. That's what I do. And I've put it into modern vernacular. I've taken all the religious language out of it. And look, if anyone wants to see anything about that work, westernmindfulness.com.au is my work and what I do. And I work with people one-on-one, guiding.
And it's online?
It's online.
You don't have to be local. Okay. All right.
Yeah, so westernmindfulness.com.au and it's I work with people all over the world, taking them through this journey. I spend about 6 months with people this process, and it's sort of formulated. And I'll just pop that into the chat.
Yeah.
If anybody else has got any questions or comments, and I'd appreciate your observations about what you've heard today, because some of this is going to be different to how things have been explained before. And if you have any observations about that, I'd be also interested.
Okay, well, I do. Oh, wait, there's something in the chat. Let's see. Can you, that was, yes. Okay, we did that. I saw a lot of parallels with the Course in Miracles, which I have studied for many, many years and facilitated courses in.
Yes, well, you would know Jerry Jampolsky, of course, was very involved with Course in Miracles, and the reason why I sort of aligned myself with Jerry's work, Jerry very tongue-in-cheek described his work as A Course in Miracles for Dummies. And I think for me personally, that's what I needed, was A Course in Miracles for Dummies, and very, very pragmatic and very down to earth. So I too have been involved, but in attitudinal healing with A Course in Miracles. That was just sharing. I had a very interesting. When my dad died when I was 29, I was raised a Mormon of all things, and I'm not in the church anymore. But and my dad had been my minister most of my life, and I had a series of dreams after he died where he came and taught me about love in a language that I'd never heard before. And
that was beautiful.
In the last dream, he said, "This is the last dream, anything you want to know?" And I asked, "Well, where does Mormonism fit into truth?" And he said, "I'll show you." And he took his hand and drew a circle. Next thing, there was a ball of golden light that was that brilliant, it made everything translucent. He said, "That's truth." And he took a little and drew a circle about a hand's width, and it left an outline. He said, "That's the Mormon church. It's a tiny part of a much bigger truth. Go and find the bigger truth." So I had all this knowledge about love from these dreams. And a few months later, it was Christmas, and my mother gave me a copy of, and she was into A Course in Miracles big time, and she gave me a copy of Teach Only Love, written by Jerry Jampolsky. And everything that Jerry had written in that book is what my father had been teaching me in these dreams. And Jerry turned up in Australia just a couple of months later, and I attended a talk that he did. I wanted to go and study with him, didn't have the financial resources. A letter turns up in the mail: "Congratulations, you've won an all expenses paid trip to America." You know, the universe sort of said, "You're going to do this, Russell, come hell or high water."
Yeah.
And that literally is the segue to what I've done and where I am now with the work and how that all happened.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for sharing your expertise and your time with us. And I just want to recommend this book so highly because it's amazing how much there is here. I mean, I have notes on almost every page and highlighting all over the place. It really is an amazing book. Learned so much about the Cathar, and I've always wanted to know more about them. And thank you. Thank you very much.
The first half of the book really gives a lot of historical context to give validation to a lot of what's there. And then the second half of the book really goes into the spiritual journey.
Yes.
So if you like history, there's some really lovely, yummy stuff around history, but it has context. And then it sort of it reveals what the deep mysteries were that they were teaching. And,
yes. Okay, well, thank you all for attending. We'll see you next time. And thank you so much, Russell, for...
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity.
Okay.